And we're back with our next module for this AD intro course, Active Directory Rights Management Services. We're pretty much going to jump right in and get into content. This one should be relatively sweet and simple. There's not a whole lot to it. It's a very functional technology, but not necessarily heavy on content. One more time, an overview, an understanding, and then managing. We're going to install this role. We're going to look at the console. It's going to go, like I said, pretty quickly. Overview of AD RMS. Information protection technology that works with AD RMS enabled applications to help safeguard digital information from unauthorized use. Really, to sum this up, what it does is it allows us to author content, define how that content can be used, and then share that content out with the world. And that definition that we've given it follows it and maintains the security we've put on that content, as opposed to a file share or a folder inside of an organization where I can directly tell that share, that folder, what users can do what. I can't necessarily do that outside of my organization. I can't restrict access to the contents of, say, a Word document outside of the boundaries of my organization itself. So AD RMS used to restrict access to an organization's intellectual property. In this case, again, we're talking documents and content. Limit the actions users can perform on content. We'll get into more details on that in a minute. And limit the risk of content being exposed outside of the organization. Again, through the second one, what we can do with content we share outside of the organization. How it works. I, as an author, and in this case I'll use Microsoft Word, I'm going to type up a Word document. Word is already at this point in its current versions a AD RMS aware application. So I, as soon as I create that document and then through the interface presented in Word, rights protect that document, I get a certificate from the RMS server. I define within that software, in this case Word, a set of usage rights, what I can do with that content, what other people can do with that content. Can they print it? Can they forward it via an email? Can they change the contents themselves? I can select all these options. I then distribute the license or distribute the file after that's all been done. There are more details we're going to go into later in terms of licenses and certificates. The recipient opens that application. They get it via an email, via a share, via a SharePoint site, via SkyDrive, whatever the method is. They acquire that data. They open that document. Well, since that document's been rights protected with my RMS server, it knows where to look to confirm its own or verify its own abilities for use. So the application, reading that information put into the document, goes and finds my RMS server, which in this case obviously has to be publicly published somehow, and enforces the rights allowed on that document. Doesn't allow that user to print it, doesn't allow that user to forward it in an email or change the contents. Options for using, again, this is just a list of some applications and what those applications allow us to do using AD RMS. Protect sensitive files, applications Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Set rights, set validity periods, so that I can both tell the document what can be done with it, view it, change it, print it. I can also set a validity period. This document can only be viewed or modified in this way for the next 3 months. Do not forward or print email. Again, Outlook, another Word or another Office application. Help protect sensitive email from being sent to the internet. Help protect confidential email from being taken outside of the company. Help safeguard intranet content. Here we talk about IE and SharePoint. I can actually use RMS, in this case with SharePoint, to protect entire document libraries with default policies. Identity federation support. We just talked about AD federation services. I can actually use AD RMS in conjunction with ADFS to protect data between organizations, allowing access to that data through federation services and protecting it with rights management services. We're going to get into some details now, some components, some certificates and licenses, really the nuts and bolts of what AD RMS does. As I mentioned before, it's a relatively straightforward technology, so a lot of this is how it works under the hood. The components. First and foremost, right in the middle, AD RMS. We have to have an RMS server to manage all of this information. We need a domain controller to manage our user accounts and access to those resources. We need an author, somebody writing this information, and we need a recipient, someone consuming this information. The I don't want to say the odd component, but the unusual component in the upper left-hand corner, SQL Server, ADRMS actually stores all of the information being saved in terms of what the rights are and who has those rights to the different content being produced in SQL Server. So all of these are required components. I guess a recipient may not be a required component, but I guess it's probably useful to have a recipient for content you're authoring. Certificates and licenses. Again, this is where we get into some nuts and bolts. Lockbox, machine certificate, rights account certificates, client licensor certificates, a publishing license, a use license, and a revocation list. All of these things are components needed by ADRMS to function correctly and provide this functionality in the first place. The lockbox is a dynamic link library used to increase security in the environment in which an ADRMS application runs. Not necessarily a required component. Machine certificates hold the computer's public key and are tied to the lockbox. We've worked with certificate services in the previous modules as well, so while the functions of these certificates may be slightly vague or complex, the certificates themselves are exactly what we've already talked about. Rights account certificate. Rights account certificates tie a user on the machine to a machine certificate. Each user on the machine has a rights account certificate. The certificate contains the user's public key as well as their private key, which is encrypted with the machine's public key. We won't go too far into detail on the encryption process. It gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. Client licensor certificate. Client and server licensor certificates allow a client to sign an issuance license. Trying to think of the best way to sum all this up or to tie these all together. In the process of encrypting or protecting documents that I've authored, there is a pretty severe exchange between me, the computer I'm on, the RMS server itself, to make sure that the contents themselves are encrypted, they're protected the right way. We get non-repudiation, which is a matter of verifying authoring. All of that is involved in this process, and all of these certificates and all of these licenses are pieces of that. So we have to have the RMS server manage all of these different pieces to ensure not only that I'm creating a document that is protected the way I want it to be, but that it stays that way, that somebody who gets that certificate or that document outside of who I'm originally intending it to go to can't see it. One great example of that is if I email this document out to anybody who doesn't have access to my RMS server, or for some reason, kind of on the flip side, if my RMS server is unavailable, part of this process of all of these certificates and all of these licenses is to encrypt that entire file at the end of its production in the first place, so that simply to open it, I have to have access to that server. How it protects content. So this is a two-part slide we're going to look at. One is really the author and content side, and one is the recipient and reading side. First of all, as an author, I'm going to use RMS for the first time and receive the rights account certificate. This relates again to that last slide, and a client licensor certificate. Happens once, and I have those for, not necessarily forever, but for a good amount of time. Once that's done, I'm going to use an ADRMS enabled application, Word, to create the file and specify user rights. Write up my Word document like I normally would, rights protect it, tell that document what can and can't be done with it. The application generates a content key and encrypts the contents. So it encrypts the content key with, I'm going to get a little complicated in this step, encrypts the content key with the ADRMS server public key and sends it to the server. The server creates and signs the publishing license. Once that's done, ADRMS, protected content file sent to the recipient. I send it to somebody, I publish it somewhere, and it sits waiting to be read. In the next step, we move on to, once that's done, how do we restrict access to that data? What happens on the recipient side? The recipient receives the file and opens it. Hopefully using an ADRMS-enabled application, otherwise it's not going to work the way they intend it to. If there is no account certificate on the current computer, the ADRMS server will issue one, and the ADRMS document lets the application know what the URL is of this ADRMS server. So that's part of step 1, that document's going to notify the user where to go look to verify all of this information. Step 2, the application sends a request for a use license to the server that issued the publishing license. So remember in the last slide, the publishing license was issued as the last step of the creation of this content before it was sent out. So if the file is published offline, we're not going to worry about offline options, but there are offline options for doing this as well. The application is going to request the RAC and publishing license for this file that it saved when it was created. The server confirms that the recipient is authorized, checks for a named user, and creates a use license for the user. The server decrypts the content key using the server's private key. Again, it's going to get a little complicated. And then re-encrypts the content key with the recipient's public key. Hopefully you're following that. It then adds the encrypted session key to the use license, which means that only the intended recipient can access the file. Really, to sum that up, the server is making sure that I'm the only person, even outside of the content, who has access to that content. The AD RMS server sends the use license to the recipient's computer. Once it's got that all packaged up, it's got the licenses correct, it's got everything encrypted the way it should be, sends it back to my computer. The application takes a look to make sure everything matches, and then allows me really just access to the document. This all happens as a precursor just to open the document. We're not even to the point of actually managing rights, but that all comes with part of the package. Once I'm allowed access to the document, it is restricted as it should be. Demonstration, we're going to jump over real quick, and we're going to install AD RMS and see what the process looks like. So we're back to our server manager. We're familiar with this. We've seen it a number of times. Add roles and features. Same starter screen. Installation type role based. We're installing a server role. Server selected, the one we're on. In this case, rights management services. We get our required additional features window popping up. Next, we don't need to add any additional features of our own. We do get a little note, one more time, what it is, what it's going to do. There are components of AD RMS themselves. We're not going to worry about federation. You can read about this right here. It does talk about using ADFS and federated relationships with other organizations. We're not going into that much detail today. Install. Again, each of the Active Directory roles installs relatively quickly. So this one shouldn't take too long, and we can hopefully wait for it to get done and then move on to the next steps. So we're going to jump back to, while that installs, our presentation. Lesson 3, managing. So we've talked about the process, we've talked about the nuts and bolts of AD RMS, how it is, how it works, all of the licenses and certificates involved, although relatively quickly. Again, mainly for the fact that the technology itself, once installed, is relatively simple to manage and maintain. It's really just technical details we're going over. We've done the install. Again, relatively simple, number of steps, and it installs. We're going to talk about managing once it's done. Role installation we've already done. Must be a member of a domain. There are roles required. Again, we're going to get this information in our additional roles as we're installing the wizard in Server Manager. It's going to install the pieces it needs. You will notice down here at the bottom, Windows Internal Database, there's also a Microsoft SQL Server at the bottom of the slide. You need one or the other. They're not both required. And a service account, almost all of the Active Directory roles do require service accounts. Let's jump back and see what our installation looks like. So it is installed. Close this. And the same interface that came up last time, the same sort of pattern. We've done our installation. It's given us a flag, post-deployment configuration. There are more steps required. It wants to walk us through setting this up the first time, which we're going to go ahead and do. Create a new root cluster. We don't already have an existing one. Specify a database server and database instance. I have not set up a separate SQL server for the sake of this demo. So we're going to use Windows internal database on this server. Okay, so next we're going to specify our service account. We've got this set up ahead of time for the sake of the demo. Next. Cryptographic mode, in this instance, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is dependent on client computers and their compatibility. There's a note in here, cryptographic mode 2 is recommended for new cluster deployments where you have ensured that all client computers have been updated to support it. So this is going to have to do with which clients you're using, how up to date they are. We're going to go ahead and use 2 for the sake of the demo. Cluster key storage, you can use RMS to manage your main cluster key. You can actually store it in RMS, or you can store it in a separate, potentially external cryptographic service provider. That's well beyond the scope here, so we're just going to use the centrally managed key storage. We do have to set that password. Cluster website, you have to have, again, the ability to communicate with clients. They do it via the web. We're going to use the default website. It's the only one we have set up. There is a note up here, again, hosted in an IIS virtual directory. So this isn't going to necessarily impact the default website itself, but it is going to add a virtual directory to it. Cluster address, in this case, we're just going to use the URL of the server we are on. Server certificate. We already have SSL on that site in IIS. We don't have to worry about that step. A name for the license or certificate, which in this case the default will do for the sake of the demo. The service connection point from RMS is essentially an address we publish to Active Directory to allow clients to find our RMS server. So we can register it now, we can register it later. If you do select later, you get the warning. You'll need to register the service connection point before clients can actually use this cluster. We'll go ahead and register it. We have no reason not to. The only reason you may do this later is if you're installing RMS and you're not an enterprise administrator. There is a note in here to register the service connection point now. You must be a member of the enterprise admins group. So a note for anyone who may be installing this in an environment where you're not the or an enterprise administrator. Confirmation of our settings, and we install. Now again, we've already installed the role. We're just configuring it. This is installing those configuration settings. It's not reinstalling the role. So we've done the install. We know the prerequisites. We've looked at these slides. We just did our configuration. So as soon as that configuration is done, we're going to jump into the console and we're going to actually look at what RMS looks like once it's installed. Again, there's not a whole lot to it. Done. We come up here to Tools, Rights Management Services. Now this might actually fail, as I was watching it connect, this failed. And this is another one of those sort of real world examples of something you may experience in your environment when you install RMS for the first time. This has failed because I've been granted administrative privileges to the cluster, but I haven't logged off and back on for those privileges to be realized. So this failure, because I'm trying to connect immediately after the configuration, is normal. I'm going to click OK, and I'm actually going to log out and back into this server, which we'll do in just a second. Now that I've logged back in again, I can reopen that same console. And as you can see, I don't even have to touch it. It just pulls up my instance right away, connects to it normally, and allows me to access RMS. So here's our console. Trust policies. One of the nice things about some of the new tools with some of the newer versions of server, I'd say after 2008, we get a lot of information in the tools themselves. There is a lot in here to read. It's actually all good to read if you're sort of like me and you learn by doing. You want to install something, you want to really get your hands dirty and figure it out by playing with it. This is the way to do so. These consoles allow you really the ease of learning as you go. Trusted user domains enable your cluster to grant use licenses to users with rights account certificates from an AD/RMS certificate cluster in another org or in a different forest. We don't have to worry about that. We're not crossing those boundaries today. But that's what this screen does. It explains what each of these are. Federated identity support, if you want to integrate with ADFS. For this sake, we're not going to worry about these right at the moment. There are default domain trusts in here, internal and internal, for our existing domain. Rights policy templates allow me as an administrator to predefine essentially permissions for different types of content. Exclusion policies let me prevent, or in this case exclude is the word, kind of the definition, lets me exclude users from the ability to use AD/RMS essentially on their content that they're creating. And then the rest of these super users and security policies in relation to managing the server and reports, statistics on the server's management themselves. So that is the console for AD/RMS. You can start at the top level, get a little bit of a summary view. Your config and logging databases are here. Your recommended tasks down at the bottom. Again, these consoles have become really, really useful tools the last few years. So we finished up the demo. The last demo was looking at that console, taking a look at what those options were, what the different nodes were. And we pick up with exclusion policies, which I just mentioned because I knew it was coming in the slide deck. So rights or exclusion policies are just that. As I had mentioned, they are a way for us to exclude certain users, or in this case, I mean, there are lots of different options, users, applications, lockboxes, and operating systems from acquiring certificates and licenses from servers in the cluster. So I can make sure that certain people, certain servers, certain circumstances will exclude the ability to protect content with RMS. Rights policy templates I also manage. Really, these are the only two nodes we cover in the slides because they're the only two that at this high level we may encounter. Rights policy templates provide a manageable, consistent way for workers to apply predefined policies to information. I can pre-build a template of how things can be protected, and in this case, the first bullet, expiration policies, and then my users, when they're using AD/RMS in their client applications, apply those templates instead of coming up with their own solutions. Set extended policies that allow content to be viewed in a browser or disable client-side caching of use licenses. And then revocation and expiration policies as well. That, as I mentioned, AD/RMS is relatively straightforward. There's not a whole lot to it. It's relatively easy to set up on your own in a demo environment, use a client computer to create some protected content, send it outside, try and use it from outside, and really see how RMS works at the user level. Again, review questions will be provided in the deck once the presentation is done and published. You'll be able to go through those, answer those, and look at the answers provided. All right, thank you for watching this module. We'll be back soon to get into the next module on the last component of Active Directory.